For those of us, or for those of you who are in business or have been in business at some time, you may have heard the phrase "vision leaks." Vision leaks. In other words, we need to be continually reminded of why we do what we do, because we so easily forget. So yes, tomorrow morning is Monday morning. The alarm clock at some point is going to go off tomorrow morning. And for those of us who are not on holiday, that means getting out of bed and going to work perhaps. And remembering why we do what we do gets us out of bed and into the shower in order to go to work. A couple of weeks ago, I heard another phrase that struck me. The gospel is slippery. The gospel is slippery. And I'll say who said that to me and why in a moment. But in a similar sense to that phrase, vision leaks, that phrase, the gospel is slippery, was a reminder to me that I need to keep reminding myself and keep applying the gospel to myself. Otherwise, its influence so easily slips away. And that's why we come to church, whether that's in person or whether that's online. That's why we make this habit of being at St. Peter's or being online. Swiss time 5:30, online probably for many of us 4:30. That's why we have this habit, so that we hear the gospel again and again and again. And I want to suggest to you that at these times, these challenging, uncertain times, there is no more vital thing that we can do than to hear the gospel again. We're kicking off a new sermon series in the book of Colossians. I'm calling it No Greater Thing. And I've pinched this title from a song written by Graham Kendrick called All I Once Held Dear. I think Rob and Alison taught us this song a while back. And the chorus goes something like this. Knowing you, Jesus, knowing you, there is no greater thing. And I want to call this series of talks in the letter of Colossians, No Greater Thing, because in this letter, Paul celebrates Jesus. Paul celebrates Jesus. And it's very difficult to miss the fact that for Paul, there is no greater thing in all the world than Jesus. And over these next 3 weeks, we're going to actually we're going to camp in Colossians chapter 1, and we're going to pick up 3 really important themes that run through this first chapter. And we're going to look at the first one this evening, and I've called it, Don't Let the Gospel Slip Through Your Fingers. Don't let the gospel slip through your fingers. And I want to share with you just some thoughts around that. Paul, this is one of Paul's lockdown letters. This is a lockdown letter. Paul's in prison. We think he's in prison in Ephesus. And he's writing to the Colossians at the same time as he writes that little letter to Philemon, an amazing letter in the New Testament. And it should come as no surprise to us that as Paul writes this letter, he begins with gratitude and he begins with prayer, as he does in so many of his other letters. And I want to say to you that in these really challenging times, 2 great practices to foster: gratitude and prayer. Gratitude has that power to lift us. I wonder if you've ever noticed that. And not only does gratitude lift us as we express gratitude to people, but as we hear people expressing gratitude for us, that lifts us as well. I'm wired in such a way that if I don't know what's happening next, I'm somebody who needs to know what's coming. If I don't know what's happening next, I very easily become irritable. And COVID for me has been a really challenging time because I'm a planner. I like to know what's happening, and I'm struggling to know how to plan for the next month, the next 2 months. And that makes me really, really grumpy. And one of the things that I found in this time that lifts me out of my irritability is actually saying thank you to people. Just being conscious of what people are doing for me and to bless me. And that might be the fact that, I open my sock drawer regularly, and it's always full, and it's got nothing to do with me. If it wasn't for my wife, I wouldn't have socks, and other precious forms of clothing as well. Just simply saying thank you. I wonder who has blessed you this week. I wonder how you would finish this phrase. I just want to say thank you for. And maybe this week you have an opportunity to actually say that to somebody. I just want to say thank you for blah, blah, blah. Also, you can't help but notice the constant way Paul prays for these people. And again, if you want to deal with your irritability, pray for the person who's making you angry and grumpy. And Paul has wonderful ways of praying for people in these opening verses. If I could paraphrase them like this, he prays for the Colossians that they would be tuned into God's will. They would live well for God. They would learn more and more about how God works. That they would have strength to stick it out over the long haul. That they would endure, and in their endurance, that they would be joyful. And so for somebody like me who's struggling at times like this, to pray for the people who might be making me irritable in this lockdown scenario, I find really helpful. And so Paul opens his lockdown letter, written from prison, with gratitude and with prayer. But the words that I want to focus on this evening come at the end of verse 6. Let me read verse 6 for you. In the same way, the gospel is bearing fruit and growing throughout the whole world, just as it has been doing amongst you since the day you heard it. And here's the phrase, and truly understood God's grace. And truly understood God's grace. There's something essential to understanding God's grace. Allowing God's grace to get hold of your imagination, to mold how you think about the world, to form how you think about yourself, to be at the very heart of your understanding of God, to truly understand God's grace. And I'm personally rediscovering just how important and essential it is to keep on diving in to God's grace. And that's not just something that I do once in this life, that it's a lifelong journey. So I told you earlier on about this phrase, the gospel is slippery. And it comes from a conversation I had with a Christian counselor called Pauline. And Pauline contacted me one time and said, if you want to have a chat, just ring me up if you just need to talk through some stuff. And so it was just great to be able to spend an hour with Pauline and just chat through some things. And what I noticed in that conversation was that as I shared with her the blessings of life and the challenges of life, that Pauline kept bringing me back to the gospel. And I said that to her, Pauline, you keep bringing me back to the good news. And she said, yes, I do, because the gospel is slippery. When you're really busy, when life is challenging, it's so easy to forget the good news. So easy to fail to allow it to shape you and the way that you would respond to the challenges of life. And so Pauline, being a very good Christian counselor, was bringing me back to the gospel because the gospel's slippery. And so I want just to spend the rest of my time with you now because in this passage, Paul brings us back to the gospel. I was one evening at theological college. Now, this is going back 1 or 2 years, perhaps 27 years, in fact. When I was at theological college, I was getting ready to go to bed, and we had shared bathrooms at theological college, and I was in the bathroom cleaning my teeth, and in walked Francie. Now, Francie was 6'5", and he was the size of a barn door. And Francie, before coming to pastor's school, to theological college, Francie was a police officer. And he was this big, burly police officer who was being trained to be a pastor. And Francie, 6'5", size of a barn door, Francie was crying. I said, Francie, what on earth is wrong with you? Because you just don't expect the big police officer to be crying. And what had happened was that Francie and other pastors in training had been together for the last hour and had shared with each other how they had become Christians. They were sharing their testimonies. And Francie had been so moved by these stories that he just couldn't stop crying. And in Colossians 1, Paul doesn't tell us his testimony. Paul doesn't tell us how he became a Christian. What Paul tells us is how we became Christians. And he tells us two things about our testimony. He tells us where we were, and he tells us what Jesus has done for us. He tells us where we were and what Jesus has done for us. So in verse 13, Paul tells us where we were. Verse 13, for God has rescued us from the dominion of darkness. And then verse 21, once you, and Paul's speaking about me, once you were alienated from God and you were enemies in your mind because of your evil behavior. Paul is telling me where I was. Paul's telling me that left up to my own devices, this is where I still would be. But Paul is telling me that God is a rescuing God. Verse 13, for he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness. When Yvonne and I were on holiday a couple of weeks ago, we went to Zermatt, and we were doing some walking around Zermatt. When we weren't walking, I was reading a book by a Christian leader called Pete Greig, who heads up an organization called 24/7 Prayer. Some of you know prayer. And in the book, he describes how 24/7 Prayer found their way to establishing a ministry in Ibiza. I won't ask you if you've been to Ibiza, but Ibiza is the clubbing center of the world. If you want to go clubbing, you go to Ibiza. And 24/7 Prayer had set up a ministry in Magaluf, the clubbing center of Ibiza. And the guy who runs it there is a guy called Brian Heasley. Now, Brian Heasley's from Northern Ireland, like myself, like all the best people are. Brian Heasley is from Northern Ireland. And in this book, Pete Greig tells Brian Heasley's story. He was born and he spent his early childhood in Northern Ireland, in Belfast. His mum and dad did their level best to bring Brian and his brothers and sisters up within the Christian faith. They left Belfast and they moved to the south of England, where Brian's father became a pastor. But then tragedy hit the family. At the age of 12, Brian's mother suddenly died. And it sent Brian into his tailspin. And he began to run with the wrong crowd. He eventually left school. He eventually left home. And he went back to Ireland and he joined a hippie colony in Cork. That didn't quite work out. And so he joined a community of Hare Krishnas in Northern Ireland. That didn't work out. And he eventually went back to home in England. But within a few months, he was in prison for armed robbery. And it was in prison that Brian, that Brian Heasley discovered the faith that he had been brought up in. God eventually rescued Brian while he was in prison, and Brian became a Christian. The work that Brian and his family are involved with in Ibiza is a work of rescue. They have a van. It's called the Vomit Van. And at night, they drive around Magaluf and they pick up people who are dangerously drunk or wasted on drugs or vulnerable to assault. And they take them back to their hotel. Now, why do they do that? Why do they do that? Because it's a statement of love. They are rescuing people. It's a statement of how valuable each human being is, even though they might be drunk or wasted on drugs, unable to stand. That person is loved and cherished by God and worth rescuing. And as I reflect upon the thought that God in Jesus came to find me, sought me out, rescued me, that is a reflection of just how loved I am. That's true of me. That's true of you. The very fact that Jesus came and went seeking after you and rescued you is a statement of just how loved you are. And allow me to say that to you tonight. God loves you. And the cross is proof of that. He's rescued you. He loves you. And so Paul wants to tell me where I was, where we were, alienated by God, but God came and rescued us. And then finally, Paul wants to tell me what Jesus has done. And he uses two beautiful words, forgiveness and reconciliation. To describe this momentous act, Paul reaches for the greatest event in Israel's history, the Exodus. And to help the Colossians grasp what Jesus has done for them, he uses Exodus language. Paul talks about Jesus coming and redeeming the Colossians. That is, setting them free from slavery. You see, to be forgiven is to be set free from the most terrible slave master, to be set free from sin. I am 51. I hate to think about that, but I am 51. And one of the things that I discover more and more the older I get is that because I'm getting older, I have a tendency of racking up more and more moments of failure. I rack up more and more people that I hurt. And this just sort of gets more and fuller and fuller and fuller. And as a 51-year-old who's hoping to make it to 52, I am so grateful that I am forgiven. I'm so grateful that I can come and to ask for forgiveness, to know that I can bring my failures and my disappointments to the cross. For he has rescued me, from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves. And if forgiveness is to be set free from slavery, reconciliation is to be brought home. If forgiveness is the removal of animosity, reconciliation is the presence of love. And the language of reconciliation is the language of homecoming. He has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves. Jesus has come to bring us home. He's brought me home. And what a home to come home to, the kingdom of the Son he loves. You see, to truly understand grace is to know not just once, but to know again and again and again and again that you have been brought home. That we truly belong to somewhere wonderful. To belong to somewhere where we know we are no longer slaves, but sons and daughters. To belong to a place where we are loved. And so as I end, can I bring you back to Pauline, this wonderful Christian counselor? She was reminding me that before I'm a pastor, before I'm a husband, before I'm a father, I'm someone who, despite my best efforts to avoid God, I am loved. I've been sought out. I've been found. And I've been brought home. So allow me the privilege of saying to each and every one of you here at St. Peter's tonight, and those of you who are online, you are forgiven. You are home. You are loved. And this is the gospel. And for those of us who have been in the Christian faith following Jesus for years, would you hear that again? And allow that just to filter deep into your heart and mind. And if you're here tonight or online and that has never been your experience, can I say that that is a gift waiting for you to receive? Jesus wants to forgive you. He wants to bring you home. He wants you to know his amazing love. Why don't we pray? Let's pray.